September 12th, 1978, was a crisp autumn morning in the small town of Cedar Ridge. The kind of morning where the air smelled faintly of pine and the school buses rumbled through the sleepy streets, carrying children to classrooms filled with eager chatter and chalk dust. At Cedar Ridge Elementary, Miss Evelyn Harper, a devoted teacher with a calm voice and watchful eyes, prepared for what should have been an ordinary day. 19 children were waiting outside, backpacks slung over their shoulders, excited for the first field trip of the school year. The destination? A nearby nature preserve, a place of towering trees, winding trails, and the promise of discovery. But for those 19 children and Miss Harper, that day would mark the beginning of a nightmare that no one in Cedar Ridge would ever forget. The yellow school bus rolled to a stop in front of the school, its familiar creak and the squeal of brakes signaling it was time to climb aboard. The driver, Walter Graves, a man in his early 50s with graying hair and a reserved demeanor, nodded curtly as the children filed on. To anyone observing, he seemed just like any other driver. Dependable, punctual, but perhaps a bit too quiet. Miss Harper took her seat near the front, clipboard in hand, counting names, making sure everyone was accounted for. The kids laughed and whispered, unaware of the storm that was about to break. As the bus pulled away from the curb, Walter glanced briefly at the rearview mirror, his eyes hardening for a split second before settling into a blank stare. He started down the familiar roads, the countryside flashing by in hues of gold and green. But something felt off, a subtle tension in the air that no one could quite place. Along the route, Miss Harper noticed Walter taking a detour, one that led them away from the nature preserve and toward the outskirts of town, where abandoned buildings and overgrown fields lay forgotten. She frowned, gently asking, "Walter, isn't this the wrong way?" Walter's response was curt. "Trust me, Miss Harper. We're just taking a shortcut." The children, sensing the change in atmosphere, grew restless. Some whispered nervously, others pressed their faces to the windows, searching for familiar landmarks that never appeared. Minutes passed, then half an hour. The bus rumbled deeper into isolated territory until it came to a sudden stop at the entrance of an old missile silo. A relic from the Cold War, long since decommissioned and sealed off by federal authorities. Walter killed the engine and turned to Miss Harper with an unsettling look. "We're here." Confused and alarmed, Miss Harper stood, asking, "Why are we stopping here? This isn't part of the field trip." Walter reached into his pocket and produced a small battered key, the very key to the school bus ignition. It was marked with deep bite marks and stained with dried blood. "I have to lock the bus up," Walter said, voice low and shaking. Before anyone could react, he grabbed the door handle and shut the doors from the outside. The children screamed, pounding on the windows, but the doors were locked tight. Miss Harper's eyes filled with tears. "Walter, please, let us out!" But Walter didn't respond. Instead, he turned away, pulling a piece of paper from his jacket pocket, forged fuel receipts he had hoped to keep hidden. The truth was coming out, and he knew it. As the hours passed, the cold concrete lid of the missile silo was sealed shut, encasing the bus, the children, and their teacher inside, a secret buried beneath layers of federal concrete and silence. The town of Cedar Ridge woke the next morning to a vanished bus, a missing teacher, and 19 children who simply disappeared without a trace. No ransom notes, no witnesses, just an empty road where a school bus should have been. Walter Graves was nowhere to be found. The disappearance of Miss Harper and the 19 children stunned Cedar Ridge to its core. Families were shattered, the community gripped by grief and fear. Every lead seemed to hit a dead end. The police scoured the roads and nearby woods, but the bus, the teacher, and the children were nowhere to be found. For weeks the town held vigils, prayers whispered into the chilly autumn winds. But one man's silence loomed over it all, like a dark cloud. Walter Graves, the bus driver. Walter had vanished without a trace the very night of the disappearance. Rumors swirled. Some said he'd fled the country, others whispered darker things, suspecting foul play. But no one had answers, and no one could understand why a man would vanish without even explaining. Yet, behind closed doors, there was a truth Walter had buried deep, one that no one could have imagined. Walter Graves wasn't just a driver. Beneath his quiet exterior hid a desperate man, tangled in debts and lies. The forged fuel receipts he'd tried so hard to hide were just the tip of the iceberg. For years, Walter had been siphoning fuel from the school bus depot, selling it on the black market to make ends meet. He thought he was clever, slipping forged documents into the piles of paperwork covering his tracks. But Miss Harper, meticulous and observant, had begun to piece it together. In the weeks leading up to the trip, she'd questioned the odd mileage on the bus logs, noticed the strange inconsistencies in the fuel reports. One afternoon, she confronted Walter quietly in the bus garage. "Walter, I know about the receipts," she said softly but firmly. "You need to stop this. Someone will get hurt." Walter's face darkened with fear and shame. "It's not like I wanted to do this, Evelyn. I needed the money. My family is struggling." "Then ask for help. Don't risk the children." But Walter was trapped. The pressure was suffocating. He feared losing his job, his home, everything. And when Miss Harper threatened to report him, something inside Walter snapped. The morning of the field trip, Walter made a decision that would change everything forever. When the bus reached the deserted missile silo, instead of heading toward the nature preserve, he pulled off the main road. His hands trembled as he turned the ignition off and locked the doors, biting into the key so hard that his teeth left deep marks. A frantic, desperate act. The dried blood on the key came from a small cut Walter had sustained earlier, unnoticed amid the chaos of his guilt and fear. Inside, the children screamed and pleaded, and Miss Harper begged for release, but Walter's mind was clouded, overwhelmed by panic, and the belief that if he could just keep them hidden, he could fix everything later. But the silo cap was sealed the next day with federal concrete, a cold, permanent barrier. Walter disappeared into the shadows of his own making, carrying the secret of that terrible day alone. For decades, the truth remained buried, lost in silence and unanswered questions. Until now. The missile silo where Walter locked the bus was no ordinary abandoned structure. Built during the height of the Cold War, it was designed as a fortress, a concrete tomb buried deep beneath the earth, meant to withstand nuclear blasts and remain impenetrable for decades. By 1978, the site had been decommissioned and sealed by the federal government, officially declared off limits and forgotten by most. Few people in Cedar Ridge even knew the silo existed, a ghostly remnant of a fearful era that had passed. Walter chose this place deliberately, knowing no one would dare to pry open a federal installation. The silo's massive steel hatch was bolted shut, then covered with a thick layer of reinforced concrete, a wall of stone and steel designed to lock away the past forever. Inside, the children and Miss Harper were trapped in the dimly lit school bus, the smell of stale air mixing with panic and fear. The windows, small and tinted, showed only darkness and cold metal walls. At first, the children cried out, pounding on the glass, their voices hoarse from desperation. Miss Harper held them close, her voice steady despite the terror flooding her heart. "We will get out of here," she whispered. "I promise." But hours turned to days, and hope began to fray. The air inside the silo grew stale, the bus's ventilation system unable to bring in fresh air. Food and water ran low, and sickness spread among the children. Miss Harper did her best, soothing frightened cries, doing all she could to keep them calm. Outside, the town's frantic search failed to find any trace of the bus or its passengers. The police, bound by jurisdictional limits and federal secrecy laws, were blocked from investigating the silo. It was a no-go zone. The official story became one of disappearance and mystery, a tragedy with no answers. Families waited for news that never came. Meanwhile, Walter Graves drifted further into isolation. Haunted by guilt, he refused to speak of that day. The weight of his secret consumed him, but fear kept his lips sealed. For 45 years, the missile silo remained a buried tomb, a place where the truth was trapped beneath layers of concrete and silence. Until the day the key resurfaced. For 45 years, the people of Cedar Ridge lived with the unbearable weight of unanswered questions and shattered lives. The families of the 19 children and Miss Harper never stopped searching, never stopped hoping, even as the years wore on. The town itself seemed frozen in time, a place haunted by the ghost of that terrible September morning. Every anniversary sparked vigils and memories, but no answers. Relatives grew old, waiting, their faces lined with grief and exhaustion. Parents clung to fading photographs and stories, trying to keep the children alive in memory. Meanwhile, Walter Graves lived under a shadow darker than any concrete tomb. He disappeared from public view, moving from town to town, working odd jobs, always watching his back. The secret he carried was a heavy chain wrapped around his soul. He never told a soul what had really happened, not his family, not the authorities. The guilt strangled him every day. Many wondered if Walter had truly lost his mind, or if the weight of the crime had broken him beyond repair. But, despite the silence, the truth refused to stay buried. It was a cold spring morning in 2023 when the sleepy town of Cedar Ridge was shaken again. This time, not by another disappearance, but by an unexpected confession. Walter Graves, now an old man with stooped shoulders and weary eyes, walked into the local police station carrying a small, weathered object, the school bus ignition key. The key was unmistakable. Deep bite marks etched into the metal, dried blood still visible in the crevices. It was the missing piece of the puzzle that had haunted the town for decades. In a trembling voice, Walter confessed everything. He told of his desperate gamble, locking the bus and the children inside the abandoned missile silo after Miss Harper uncovered his forged fuel receipts. He revealed the crushing guilt that had eaten away at him for 45 years. But there was more. Walter explained how, the very next day, federal agents had sealed the silo with concrete, effectively burying the truth and everyone inside. Authorities scrambled to respond. Attempts to open the silo began, but bureaucratic red tape and legal barriers stalled the operation. The site remained off-limits, a federal jurisdiction that no one dared to cross easily. Still, the town's hope was reignited. For the first time in decades, the possibility of closure, or rescue, flickered. Walter's confession cracked open a long-sealed wound, forcing Cedar Ridge to confront a painful past. The news of Walter Graves's confession sent shockwaves through Cedar Ridge. Families gathered, some trembling with hope, others bracing for the worst. The federal government announced plans to carefully examine the missile silo, but progress was slow. The concrete seal was thick, and safety protocols demanded caution. Inside the community, emotions ran wild. Some saw Walter as a villain, a man who betrayed innocent lives. Others viewed him as a broken soul, crushed by guilt and regret for decades. Forgiveness seemed impossible, yet the desire for answers was overwhelming. As excavation began, experts revealed little at first. The bus remained unreachable, entombed beneath layers of concrete and earth. The silence from inside the silo was deafening. What exactly awaited within? Were the children and Miss Harper still alive, or had time claimed them all? The questions haunted everyone. Walter, now frail and alone, watched from afar as his long-kept secret unraveled. He offered no excuses, only sorrow, a man crushed by the consequences of his desperate choice. In the end, Cedar Ridge was left with a chilling reminder. Some secrets, buried deep beneath concrete and decades, can never fully be unearthed. The vanished teacher and 19 children became a ghost story, a haunting legacy of fear, betrayal, and the fragility of trust. And the missing key, a symbol of a terrible past, rested quietly in evidence, a small, battered relic that had finally unlocked a long-forgotten truth.